Welcome back to a bit Gamey and a series on history that I'm going to do. And I'm not claiming to be a big expert or anything, but from my reading, there's a few little odds and ends which don't seem quite right to me in the difference between standard opinion and mine. And the first one's on the Blitzkrieg and the idea that and also how these historical questions relate to wargaming. So a lot of wargaming rules, the Germans are given various national traits, and the Germans are given various national traits to kind of help explain the rapid success of the Blitzkrieg years, where the fall of France in 6 weeks, Poland in I don't know however long, all these conquests which either never happened in the First World War or took months or years, and how it was all done in a few days. And I think a lot of it is really it's really just a fluke. It's just it was the timing that was what made it work. So if you think about the progression of technology in the 20th century, you start off with infantry dominant, and at the beginning of the First World War, you get to this point where heavy machine guns are dominant. Heavy machine guns beat infantry, and that's why the First World War was such a nightmare. And then towards the end of the First World War, you slip into this stage where tanks beat heavy machine guns. And that was the end of that. And you're still in this phase at the beginning of World War II. Heavy machine guns beat infantry, tanks beat heavy machine guns, and you're at that point before you get to the next stage, which is where anti-tank guns beat tanks. So this is the phase where you're in the Blitzkrieg. And that, in my opinion, is why it was so successful. And when you think about what happened with the various armies after the Blitzkrieg, the Americans with their tank destroyer doctrine, the Russians and Germans having their assault guns, which could be turned into tank destroyers straight away. So basically you need mobile anti-tank weapons, and lots of them. To beat the Blitzkrieg, you need lots of anti-tank guns and mobile ones, so that they can all be rushed. So wherever a breakthrough happens, you can rush loads of anti-tank guns to that to the breach, and to knock down the any attempt of Blitzkrieg happen afterwards. Because if you think about the what happened during World War II, after when the Germans were dominant, you had the Blitzkrieg era, the Blitzkrieg phase, but when Russia and America or whatever became dominant, they couldn't do the Blitzkrieg then, because the Germans had already had the doctrine for how to block it, with mass anti-tank guns. So there was just a phase where Blitzkrieg was possible, and that was just at that phase before anti-tank guns became dominant. So it's mostly, in my opinion, it's mostly a fluke of timing that the World War II started at that point, at point A, called it A, where tanks beat machine guns, and then within a year or so, it shifted to the point where anti-tank guns beat tanks. So that, to my mind, is the main reason why the Germans were so successful in those first couple of years. It was just because it was the phase in the progression of technology. But why did it carry on after that? So, I think the first few years of the war, Germans didn't. Germans had a lot of Panzer ones, Panzer twos, weren't very good. You got most of the army was horse drawn. no doubt, a lot of the things people have said in the past about advantages, like having radios in the tanks and stuff like that, are all true. But I think the initial success is really just a question of luck, that they just happened to attack at the point before anti-tank guns became dominant. At the point where the tanks were dominant, they did all their great success, and then anti-tank guns became dominant, and the whole war changed then into lots of the whole like the Eastern Front thing with salients and pockets and all that jazz. You couldn't break through enough. You could break through wherever you chose to break through by creating a local superiority, but you couldn't do the whole race to the channel type deal anymore. So, but it didn't turn into a complete kind of 50-50 deal after the end of that. So why did Germans have advantage for longer after that initial phase? And I think the reason for that is basically veterans. If you win, then you get veterans, and if you lose, you don't. Either you might end up dead or prisoners, or your country has to surrender, and then it's all wasted. Whereas those first few years of early success, gave the Germans opportunity to develop lots of veterans, and that doesn't just mean combat veterans. People who actually had lots of combat. It includes all the logistics and all the planning and all the kind of stuff to do with that, like practice at getting close air support organised. Pilots being better, tank commanders being better. So I think the initial victories, like say in Russia, were to do with the timing of the attack, just at the point where tanks were dominant, and then gradually the Soviets sort of kind of figured out how to counter that with defence in depth and masses of mobile anti-tank guns who can be moved to any breach. But it still took them time to, the Germans had like a year or two head start in terms of generating veterans. I say it's not just combat veterans; it's all the people who do the supplies. Because a lot of time in any kind of peacetime corporate environment, people are getting promoted more or less on on seniority and just being around. And then when a war happens, then you find out that some people just can't handle the pressure, or they're just not as good at getting their job done, and so they get replaced. So the Germans had like a 2-year head start on that process because they'd been winning. They had a 2-year head start on that process, and it took Russia, because it was big enough for them to take the punishment long enough. It took them a couple of years to generate the same level of veterans, and similar with Britain, because they had the Channel. They could generate the veterans in North Africa or whatever. So when the Americans first landed in North Africa, they got pasted by the Germans initially, because I think it's because they had more veterans. Basically, no doubt there's other factors as well. But I say when other countries developed those same level of factors like radios, for example, they were still lagging behind because they didn't have the veterans. Then over time, of course, it shifts around because as you take casualties, the Germans lost the veteran advantage. So that's my take on the Blitzkrieg. And so all these rules which say Germans do this, and this, I don't know if that's. It doesn't matter. You can do it any way you want. But I think if I was going to do it, I'll just have the Germans have more veterans basically, and just do it that way. You have rules where being veterans gives you an advantage. Like veteran officers have a longer command range. A lot of rules that will say, Germans can have like a wider command range, for example, because of whatever reason, training or radios or whatever. But I just think, a veteran officer has a longer command range than a green one, and you just give the Germans more veterans at the beginning, and it evens out later on. So that's my theory on Blitzkrieg. It was a fluke. It was timing. The war started just at a point where technology was at a certain level, and that's why the Blitzkrieg happened. And then later, everyone, the Americans had their tank destroyers, Russians and the Germans moved their assault guns into being tank destroyers. Playing in countries like Britain and Italy in the desert, in a rush to create mobile anti-tank guns. So they put anti-tank guns on the back of trucks, put 2 pounders on a portee, etc. So I think it was just timing. The Blitzkrieg was just timing, and then the success led to having more veterans. I say that's, I think that's possibly similar for other periods in history as well, like Napoleon. You get winning, and so the veterans on the other side, they didn't really get a chance to develop a kind of long-term veteran program, whereas his guys get winning, so he get generating more veterans and keeping them in the army. So the army just got better and better, and up to the point where they start taking too many casualties, and people get old. So anyway, that's my theory on Blitzkrieg. Toodle pip.